So welcome back, or welcome to everyone. My name's Marc Fein. Currently live in Israel, a Jewish educator who enjoys the intersection of Jewish thought and wisdom and personal development. And we decided to go on this journey together in the lead up to the holiday of Shavuot, and the idea of how do we personally develop ourselves as that we're ready to receive the Torah. And the structure of our class and time together is that we take a value of some kind, explore the Jewish text and some meaning behind it, and then conclude with a reflective activity so we can apply it directly back into our own lives. So that way everybody leaves with a knowledge, an action, and hopefully a new mindset and perspective of how this particular Jewish value and text can inform their lives as people and as Jews. And we started with compassion. Last week was wisdom, and this week is happiness, which was, I was telling Julie earlier, actually a bit harder to prepare than I anticipated. But we're going to go on this journey together, and it'll be amazing because it always is. So what I'm going to ask is if you can pop in the chat. We do our best to keep it as interactive as possible. When you think of Jewish texts related to happiness, there are a few classic ones that come to mind. If you can put it in the chat, when you hear a Jewish text related to happiness, it could be a song. It could be, we have a Ashrenu from Bena. There are a few classic songs and classic texts. It's classic because I know them, and soon you will too. It's one of my favorite things about Jewish educators when they go, oh, there's this famous story and source. It's famous because I know it. Okay, we got from Sharon, Adon Olam. We have from Melinda, who is, in this case, who is wise, really, who is rich. Ezu hu ashir, hasamech bechalko, one who is happy with their lot. Is one of the classics, and there are a few others as well. But we're going to start with the one that Melinda suggested. Ezu Ashir, who is wealthy, Hasamech bechelko, and this is where translation starts to get a little bit of fun, because if there are any English professors on the call, every translation is an act of interpretation. So for now, we're going to keep it as Hasamech bechelko, and think for yourself, is there a difference if I translated that as who is happy with their lot versus who is satisfied with their lot versus who is joyous with their lot? And how each one of those words, the nuance shifts. Well, what is it that we're actually doing? So let's go to some original source text, because Pirkei Avot is already in rabbinic literature. Let's go back to the original text. Let's go back to the Bible. So there are a few references in the Bible to the idea of simcha. One of them is in Devarim, Deuteronomy, which is always fun to say, chapter 16, verse 14 and 15. V'samachta b'chagecha, that you shall rejoice in your festival. Ata bincha b'techa v'avdecha v'matecha, with your son and your daughter, with your slaves and family and the entire community. And then in verse 15, Shivat yamim tachog l'Hashem Elokecha b'makom asher yivchar Hashem, you shall hold a festival for the Lord your God 7 days in the place that the Lord will choose. And the verse finishes, v'hayita ach sameach, and you shall have nothing but joy. So that's one source text already there that you should notice already. You should be joyous and rejoice on the holiday. And the Gemara, which we're not going to get into, but it's interesting to note, they explain what does it mean to be joyous. They say there is no happiness except with wine and with meat. Not going to explore that particular one, but it's interesting that it's out there. The verse that we are going to explore together is actually in Tehillim, in Psalms, which is another one of those fun words to say, Psalms 100, which you will be able to post in the chat. And There's also a song that goes along with it. Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha, bo lefanav birnana. Worship the Lord in gladness. Come into his presence with shouts of joy. Already interesting, just in terms of translations and why I had such a hard time putting this class together. Sameach, even by the way, both of those are from Sepharia. So in theory, we're using the same translation protocols. Translated differently in Deuteronomy than it was in Psalms. In Psalms, they said worship the Lord in gladness was how they translated simcha. And in Deuteronomy, they said, you shall rejoice in your festival. So again, just putting it out there that the word simcha might not have a perfect English corollary. Something that's worth exploring and thinking about. But the reason why I like going back to source text is because there's a continuation. So Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha bo lefanav birnana. There are now 2 verses after that I think will explain how do we worship God with happiness? How does happiness come to be? But before that, I have another question, which is, how can you command anyone to be happy in the first place? It says, oh, you shall rejoice in happiness. And you should worship God with happiness. And Rav Nachman of Breslov says, mitzvah gedola liot b'simcha tamid. It is a great commandment to be happy always. Not just that you should perform the commandments with joy or with happiness, but that it is an actual great commandment that you should always be happy. How can you command someone to be happy? I understand how you can command someone to perform an action. I can do that. There's something physically I'm doing. But how can I, just be happy. Okay, I am now happy. Like, what am I doing? How do I shift in that way? So to explore that, we're actually going to explore the opposite of that, which in some ways is jealousy. Because this is a question that's asked on the 10 Commandments. One of the 10 Commandments is lo tachmod. Thou shalt not covet, if we're going into ye olde English. But really, those shouldn't be jealous. And the rabbinic commentators ask the same question there. I understand how you can command someone to not kill. I understand how you can command someone to not commit adultery. I can understand how you can command someone to keep the Sabbath. But how can you command someone to not feel something? Like, feelings happen. In theory, they're not in my control. So how can I command them not to feel? And there are 2 different interpretations that I heard. I'm posting the article that I read it in here rather than the original source text, just because I think it's much clearer. One approach, both of them given by medieval commentators, one of them being the Ibn Ezra, and the other being the Ramban. So the Ibn Ezra says, how can you command someone not to be jealous? That no commoner ever thinks they're going to marry the princess. He knows the princess is out of his league. It's human nature that one only has desires for things he can relate to. They don't covet things which are so far removed that there's not a chance. So according to the Ibn Ezra, one only covets if they think there is something that should belong to them that currently doesn't. And that can only happen if you believe that God was supposed to give you something that he didn't. So it comes back to a philosophical mindset and really belief that if I truly believe that God gave me what I was supposed to be getting, then I wouldn't be jealous of anything else because I wasn't supposed to have it in the first place. So that jealousy is actually an outgrowth of, I don't believe God gave me what I needed. And that's the thing that I can work on for myself. That I can work on my emunah, I can work on my belief. And if I truly had belief, then I wouldn't be jealous. Because I believe I have everything I'm supposed to have. And the Ramban takes a similar perspective that one's only jealous of somebody else if you believe that you in some way should be better than that other person. I deserve what that person has because I am better in some way than that person. It's not that I can't live with what I want, it's that I can't live with them having something that I think is better than what I should be having. And it really gets back to that same principle of there is something that I believe I should have that I currently don't. Seema commented to me, it's aspirational. You can be happy if you approach things with a presumption of gratitude and satisfaction. It comes back to the idea of something being wealthy if they are happy with their lot, which is the exact connection that we're going to make. Because I am only jealous if I believe there is something I should have that I don't. So on the flip side, I will be happy or I will be satisfied if I accept that everything that I currently have is actually what it is I'm supposed to be having. So as Deb said, it's a conscious decision. I am choosing to believe that what I have is what I'm supposed to have. Nancy asked, have money, objects, family, lucky experiences, health? So the answer is yes. That whatever it is that is happening to me right now is exactly what is supposed to be happening to me right now. And Julie messaged me that jealousy in some way equals anger at God. And I think that could actually be correct. Oh God, how come you didn't give me this that you gave to this other person? And that jealousy in some ways is both a character and philosophical flaw. Thank you, Deb. And how do we know that this is based in some way, not just in the rabbis, but in the text? Because if you go back to that verse in Tehillim, and I'll share screen now just to make sure everyone can see it, because advanced sharing, share, application, here we go. Here are the four or five verses that we were just talking about from Tehillim. Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, bo lefanav b'ernana. Worship the Lord b'simcha. Okay, but how do I do that? What is that based off of? Well, let's read the next verse. De'u ki Adonai hu Elohim hu asanu v'lo anachnu amo v'tzon marito. Acknowledge that the Lord is God. He made us and we are his people and the flock that he tends. How do I worship God with happiness? If I acknowledge that the Lord is God and that he made us and we are his. We are his nation and we are the flock that he tends. He is the one taking care of us. And if I truly believed that, then I would be able to offer God with happiness, with satisfaction, because I would be able to see that, well, everything does come from him. Now, there are going to be a few philosophical questions that can really come out of this. And Sherry asked one of them that could go the other way. For those with low self-esteem, they can believe that they don't deserve anything of worth or value. What then? There are a few other questions that if I were to open this up, oh, but Mark, how do you explain objectively bad things? How am I supposed to be happy that this bad thing that I know is objectively bad happened to me? How do I view that as a gift? How do I view that? How can I still be happy with that? So there are going to be two different stories that I share. And then we're going to do the activity. And I hope, Sherry, that this also answers your question. Liat gave a source, Masha Shali. We're actually going to talk about that next week in our class on, or 2 weeks, in our class on generosity. So there's a character. You know what? We're going to start with story number 1, then we're going to go into the Gemara character. So this story, because for anyone who is here on Compassion knows that we enjoy some of our crazy stories. I actually found in an H.com article, but I believe it's actually a Chinese proverb. Either way, I don't let the truth get in the way of a good story. There was once a farmer who owned a horse. One day the horse ran away. All the people in the town came to console him because of the loss. "Oh, I don't know," said the farmer. "Maybe it's a bad thing, and maybe it's not." A few days later, the horse returned to the farm accompanied by 20 other horses. Apparently, he had found some wild horses and made friends. All the townspeople came to congratulate him. "Now you have a stable full of horses." "Oh, I don't know," said the farmer. "Maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's not." A few days later, the farmer's son was out riding one of the new horses. The horse got wild and threw him off, breaking the son's leg. All the people in town came to console the farmer because of the accident. "Oh, I don't know," said the farmer. "Maybe it's a bad thing, and maybe it's not." A few days later, the government declared war and instituted a draft of all able-bodied young men. They came to the town and carted off hundreds of young men, except for the farmer's son who had a broken leg. "Now I know," said the farmer, "that it was a good thing that my horse ran away." So it's interesting. The version that I heard originally didn't include that last line from the farmer. The original that I heard was, "Maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's not." And I think that was actually like a little twist. The person who was sharing the story, because they wanted it to end optimistically. Oh, I didn't know that was from Maurice Schwartz's book. I happen to love Maury. He was a former regional director of Upstate New York NCSY. I was a regional director of Upstate New York NCSY, and always felt a connection as a result. I posted the story to Julie, who will post it to everybody else. It's an interesting perspective, and you actually see that perspective also in the Gemara, because you have a character called Natan Ish Gamzu. And the defining character trait of Natan Ish Gamzu was that he would say to everything, Gamzu Latova. Everything is for the good. Everything in life is for the good. No matter what happened, it was for the good. It's the way that it was supposed to be. With one exception. They said that Gamzu Latova, with the one exception of death. And that was Baruch Dayan Emet. That was blessed is the true judge. That I still believe it's true, but I can't necessarily see the good in it right now. And I think that on its own is a very powerful statement. Because someone asked earlier about the wanting to deserve more or unfortunate things happen, or people low self-esteem and sort of like the self-pity of, oh, this didn't deserve to happen to me. That it's possible that level 1 might be, I understand that this is true, and I might not be able to see that it's good yet, but I understand that this is true. And that level 2 might be, oh, how could I see the goodness in this? So if we wanted to use, I guess, a little bit more technical language, level 1 would be, how do I view events as neutral? And the second level might be, well, how do I view it as good? And when I can get to a point where I can view everything in my life as good, or since we're talking in a Jewish context right now, everything in my life is from God. And since everything in my life is from God, therefore everything in my life is supposed to happen the way that it's happening. And because everything in my life is happening the way it's supposed to be happening, therefore, right, and Alana just messaged me something very similar to what I was saying, that when I say that something is good, my definition of good right now is that it happened the way that it was meant to happen. And because it happened the way that it was meant to happen, that is, I can accept that. And because I can accept that, I can, and this is where we get into either be happy or satisfied with, depending on your definition of simcha. And how would my life change? And how would I live life differently if I viewed everything that happened to me as the thing that was supposed to happen to me at the time. And perhaps only in retrospect, similar to the story that we shared, does the reasoning become clear. And how differently would I approach life if I might not understand why this is happening to me now, but I trust that in the end, it's going to be what was supposed to be for me. And this is something that Nancy shared. And now we're getting the real questions from, actually from Deborah and Deborah. One question, can he actually say the pandemic is something good? Second question, even the Holocaust, was that supposed to happen? And what I'm going to ask you to do on a personal level, and now I told Julie we weren't going to have a video today, but I just thought of a perfect video. So we will now have a video, which is quickly becoming mandatory for these classes. I'm going to ask you to think of an event in your life that at the time seemed negative, but as your life continued, you recognize that it's what had to happen for you at that moment. So, for example, when I'm not teaching this class, one of the things that I do is mental health advocacy. And I actually share my own experiences with depression at different schools and congregations. Now, at the time, did I view that as, oh, I'm so happy this is happening to me. This is perfect. We should all experience depression in our lives. No, that was not my experience of it at the time. And years later, looking back on it, because that experience happened, I'm now able to. And it's what, from my perspective, had to happen so that I am able to now speak and work in the way that I'm going to work. So that's going to be the reflection. Correct. So it's always nice to have former staff here. Alana Bauman shared that one of the things I love to share is Rev Soloveitchik, as quoted by Rev Sachs, makes a distinction when we ask about things that happened in our life between lama and lima, which is spelled the same, lamed mem he. Lama is why, lima is for what. Why, lama is a past-oriented question. Why did this happen? Which no one can ever really know. Lima is, well, now that this has happened, lima, toward what? Toward what end is this going to happen? Essentially, how do I create meaning out of it? And I'm going to share an article here that I'm choosing not to go into because it's less Torah, more current psychology. But Daniel Kahneman, who is a Nobel Prize-winning economist, talks about what's the distinction between happiness and satisfaction and meaning. There's another great TED Talk about steps to create a meaningful life. But I do think those are all related. But the question about the pandemic, if you give me one moment, there's a video called The Great Realization. Let's see if I can find it. Great. And this is where things get tricky. Especially, again, once you start. Okay, so I appreciate Jane. Well, I'm not going to share now what Jane shared, but she messaged an experience that was terrible at the time that it happened, but over time it became clear that it was Litova. It was for the good. Oh, okay. Thank you, Jane, for permission. That her divorce was a terrible experience at 28, but over time it became clear that it was Litova in the grand scheme of her life. And I think that's where some of the, I would say, amuna or trust comes in that we were talking about, was looking at things in the grand scope of a life or a grand scope of history. And it's not for me to say that anything was good or bad as much as it happened, and therefore I believe that it happened the way that it had to happen. And now what? Now what's the lemma? Shir just shared, there are no bad things. Everything God does is good, and hence everything that happens is good. Things may be painful, unwanted, or sad, but never bad, which I actually think is a very nuanced distinction between what are emotions that we experience versus what are the labels we put on those emotions. Like how many of us, even as I was talking, like, oh, but those are positive emotions versus negative emotions, which is already a label, versus these are simply emotions. Thank you, Shir, for that. So to another example, getting laid off was scary, but I opened my own practice, which was wonderful eventually. Thank you for sharing that. Someone else, we may not have to believe that something had to happen a particular way. However, we can still find the positive in the challenging experiences. So this person's example, they survived a heart attack and they don't believe that it should have happened, but now that it did happen, how do I create the meaning out of that? And if we were to put it in a sentence, I would say jealousy is when my expectation of what should be doesn't meet my reality of what is. And I would say the same for disappointment or for sadness, is when my expectation for how I believe something should be isn't what it currently is. And now what? And I think that the real wisdom in that verse of Ezu Asher Sameach Bechelko is, instead of trying to change the reality, to change my expectation, to accept what is. And when I accept, that's what allows for the happiness, the joy, the satisfaction to occur. How do I accept what is? And that goes back to that verse in Tehillim of know that everything is from God. And if everything is from God, therefore that it is, we'll put in air quotes, good, or the way that it was supposed to be. And now how do I internalize that? And this is going to be the trend that you've already seen in 3 classes, it's going to continue for the next 3, is that it's all mindsets. That's not about acquiring. You can Google afterwards, called the hedonistic treadmill, is another concept in positive psychology, that you end up on this treadmill of, oh, if only I get the $10,000 raise, the bigger house, etc. You get that momentary burst of happiness, and then your expectations reset, and then it's on to the next thing, and then on to the next thing. So Sharon just said an important point that I want to clarify. To me, this says we should never feel sad, which I think is wrong. We need to feel sad or unhappy at times in order to appreciate the wonderful moments in life and in the goodness. And I want to clarify, and this is what Shir said before, that it's not about not feeling sad or not feeling unhappy. It's about how do I label or interact with that. So for instance, you have, and we say this in the verse, like God created light and darkness. You need both. Even when it's said, and this goes back to the story of Natan Ish Gamzu, that you can say Gamzu Latova with the exception of Baruch Be'an Emet, with the exception of death. There are certain things that I can't see how this can be good right now. And I can still acknowledge this as emet, as truth, that this is happening. So in no way, and I think you even heard this in the tone of my voice and the way we approach this class, are you hearing, okay, so every morning, wake up and go, if you're happy and you know it, clap your hands, and do that every single time something like happens over the course of the day. And oh no, this is actually the best thing ever right now. Thank you so much. And the reason why this is the best thing ever is because, again, we all have that friend. You can Google the term toxic positivity. That's what I think toxic positivity is. Everything is positive all of the time. Well, then you're, in that case, nothing is. You need the contrasts. You need that. Both are true. So it's the full expression, but it's an acceptance and a mindset and a perspective. That's also why I kind of like the term satisfaction better than happiness in this regard, because when we're satisfied, we're accepting of what is. Sima asked, and for those who don't believe or whose faith have been shaken, who can't just give it over to an all-powerful being? A lot of the ideas that we're talking about, you can also find, honestly, in Eastern philosophy, an idea of accepting what is. And the language that I chose to use was explicitly Jewish and religious language because of the nature of this class. And I could just as easily have given this exact class without any of the Jewish texts, if you will, and said, okay, like, let's talk about acceptance and the power of acceptance, and acceptance versus expectations, and satisfaction versus happiness. And how can I learn to zoom out and see the broader picture of how things have happened in my life? And if I believe that everything is a self-generated mindset, then what does that mean for how do I choose to live my life going forward? And honestly, maybe that whole question I asked about, oh, can I just choose an emotional state? Maybe the answer is actually yes. And that whole question of can you command someone to leave emotionally actually is a legitimate question. Because if I am in enough control of myself, I am able to choose an emotional state. And this has nothing to do with God. And Jane used the word reframing. Yeah, like all the language I just used was from a cognitive behavioral therapy, which has zero religious basis whatsoever. And I think one of the interesting things that I enjoy about these classes is there are a lot of things that we think are external to our tradition. When the reality is, if we dig into our texts, we're going to see like a lot of deep wisdom and techniques and beliefs and thoughts. Apparently, Susan told me that CBT was developed by Dr. Beck, who is Jewish. Add him to the list. And Nancy said Jews also believe about the need for Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara. We're going to cover that in Encourage next week. Julie from Jennifer, Buddhist monk, I'm not going to bother pronouncing the name, I apologize, says equanimity, acceptance is not indifference.
Thich Nhat Hanh.
Thank you. Truth is truth, regardless of what tradition you find it in. We have, as Jews, a particular tradition, and therefore I think it's infused with particular beliefs and meanings. And I believe this is, and this came up in our first class, oh, if you didn't have a particular experience, can you still access that truth? And I think the answer is yes. I think there are a lot of different paths, and this is also in our tradition when it comes to Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, that they had two different paths to get to the same point. I think there are a lot of different paths to get to truth, and this is one of them. And if this path doesn't work for you, there are lots of other paths I think we can go on. So Sherry messaged me, and I know we're going over, but obviously at any point if people want to sign off, they can. It's just a rich conversation, and it's clear that I touched on a couple of potential fault lines, and I think it's important to surface it just to talk about it. From a chaplaincy point of view, this is troubling, as the message I hear is, you might not understand this now, but in time, you will see it as good supposed to happen. Isn't it legitimate to just admit there are things that really are horrific that we can't understand and never will? Sometimes there's no making sense of tragedy. And I think the answer is yes. And that's the Baruch Dayan Emet piece. There's actually, it's interesting, if you go to the verse in Psalms, Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha bo lefanav bir nana. So when I was doing my research, the Sefer Hasidim actually comments on that exact verse, that it also says in Tehillim, chapter 2, verse 11, Ivdu et Hashem b'yira, that you also have to worship God through we'll call it through awe or through fear. So they asked the question of, well, like, how do you do that? How is it possible to both Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, to worship God through happiness, and at the same time, Ivdu et Hashem b'yira, worship God through awe or through fear? And the Sefer Chassidim says that if someone is too happy, remind them that eventually they're going to die. And they will learn to worship God through awe or through fear. And if someone's too sad, there's a different verse in the Torah that you can quote them. And there's a different story that I will say is a famous story, but will become famous because I'm sharing it with all of you. It's the story of a Gam Zeh Yavor, this too shall pass. And the idea was that there was a king who asked an artisan to make for him a ring that will make him sad when he's happy and happy when he's sad. And that inscribed on the ring, it said, Gam Zeh Yavor, this too shall pass. It's all temporary. And I think, and I hope, Sherry, this addresses your question. What I think is you're presented poles of the human experience. And I think that people need different things at different moments. And something an educator told me that like really resonated with me is that the opposite of truth isn't a falsehood. The opposite of truth is another profound truth. That the opposite of truth isn't falsehood. The opposite of truth is another profound truth. And I think that there are going to be moments in life that are what we'll call, to use the language of this particular class, there are moments of, I can't comprehend how this happened. This is tragic. This is awful. I don't understand why. And this is, I don't get it. Yeah, there are going to be moments like that in the moment, 1,000%. And it might be possible, and I think it might be a worthwhile perspective, maybe not to share in that moment because they're not open or ready to have that in that moment, or maybe not ever for that person. But the possibility that later on, it might be possible to view it as, well, how is this what needed to happen for me? And there are a few examples coming in from the chat, which I'm going to share without names. I had twins that died at birth, prompted me to become a therapist. Now, would I ever in a million years tell someone who experienced that sort of tragedy in the moment, don't worry, eventually you're going to understand how you can create good out of this? Of course not. That would be emotionally like irresponsible beyond words. Beyond. And this person, who again I don't know and whose name I'm not going to quote, found a way to create meaning out of that for themselves, and she's messaging me now, and it took a long time for her to do that. And knowing that as a possibility made a difference. Someone else just messaged me, dealing with several personal crises helped me to become knowledgeable enough to help others. So again, I'm not saying this is it's a tool. Not every tool is right for every moment. And I think it was Sherry. I apologize for mixing up the names. Yeah, it was Sherry. That's not what I would say to someone in the moment. Absolutely not. That might be a conversation a few years down the line. It might be something that I find useful for myself as a tool to be aware of, even if I'm not accessing it at that moment. Someone messaged me, and I'm going to address it on a philosophical level rather than a personal level, because I don't feel this is the appropriate forum on a personal level to be advice giving, because I it's just not. Someone asked about death and a relative, that someone who they were close with died 3 years ago. Now, why would that ever be good for me? So without, again, I'll address this purely on a philosophical level. Did anybody here watch The Good Place? Anybody? We got a couple of hands up. Okay, Susan has watched The Good Place. So if you haven't seen The Good Place, massive spoiler alerts. Now is your time to sign off. So if you're still on, I'm assuming either you have seen The Good Place or you're okay with the spoiler alert that is about to happen. One of the fundamental ideas of The Good Place was that what does the afterlife look like? And one of the versions of the afterlife that was created was, we'll call it the never-ending pleasure dome. In season 5, that because a world of never-ending pleasure would be the ultimate afterlife. And what they came to realize that a flaw in that system was that if something's never ending, okay, don't give up the current season. That's okay, Jen. Nothing that I said have any like twists or turns, whatever. One of the flaws in that system was that if something doesn't end, it loses joy. It loses meaning. Think of a 3-year-old kid in a candy shop. And this goes back to what someone said earlier about why you need darkness to also have light, and why you also need sadness and also to have happiness, that you also need endings in order to have beginnings, and you also need endings in order to have middles. And that's not to say that the ending is a good thing. And it might be possible that the fact that there is an ending is what allowed for everything beforehand to come into existence. And that might be, yeah, someone shared, Leonard Cohen said, the cracks are where the light comes in, is a great quote. Someone else messaged me, time doesn't heal all wounds, but as time passes and we become removed from the intense pain and emotional charge of the moment, we may be able to see more meaning in that event, that I might not be able to view that thing that happened as for my own good, but I learn how to live with that experience and make it a part of who I am and inform who I am going forward. I think, and I hope what you're hearing me isn't anything pithy. And I think one of the main goals of this particular class is to take something like, oh, Ezehu Asher, Sameach Bechelko, as like, hey, this is what it means to be happy according to Judaism, and actually break it down and explore what are the ramifications and what are the tensions and how does this play out, and what's objective versus what's subjective, and what's my mindset based upon where I am. And like it is, and this is why someone asked me to explain earlier, like how the opposite of a truth could be another great truth. It is both possible and true that everything happening right now with the pandemic is awful. There is a lot of awful. I think that is a true statement. And I can go through a list of all the awful things. And it is also true that if you look at pollution in the environment or people spending time at home, and like you can go through all those other things also. And that's not to say it's a moral calculus. That's not to say that one is happening because of the other. Like they're both true. These bad things are happening and these good things are happening. They're both true. Baruch Dayan Emet moments happen and Gamzu Latova moments happen. Both are true. And no amount of, oh, just focus on the positive. Again, I personally don't, I think that's only healthy if you're focusing on the positive, but not ignoring the negative. The negative is still there. Or if you prefer to use the language of this class, that's what I don't understand yet is still there. And you can't ignore that. That they're both there. Baruch Emet is there and Gamzu Latova is there. Happiness is there and sadness is there. What we're describing is really an approach to life, an approach to relationships. And so Jenny just mentioned, I use hardship as a way to grow closer to God, which I find to be life-giving even in the darkest moments. So Jenny experienced hardship, and that's what she took out of it. Someone else might have experienced hardship and taken the exact opposite message out of it. That's okay. What I think, and this is the part that I think is both really challenging and really potentially empowering, is that there are a lot of things that happen in our lives that we view as, in air quotes, objectively bad, when we have the ability to maybe take a step back and, okay, what meaning am I creating to it, or what story am I applying out of it, and how did that story or event change over the course of my life, even though the facts didn't? Like the facts of, just to pick examples that people gave in the class today, the facts of I got divorced didn't change. How that got integrated into their life, that changed over time. The fact of a particular other tragic circumstance didn't change. How they related to that did change over time. The facts didn't change, but we did. And I think that's a potentially really empowering perspective. And just to emphasize, because Sherry brought up earlier and really important, that might not be the right perspective to tell someone in the moment. And it's a useful tool to have for those moments. Even if the acknowledgement is, I don't understand how I could possibly see it right now, and I might never will. But and I think, so I'll close with Deb. Part of the reason that older people are more wise, we need those experiences to learn from. And I really want to acknowledge all of you. Because there's still 93 people on this call, which is really impressive from a retention perspective, that we started with 100 and change and we're 20 minutes over and 93 people are still here. But also on two other levels. One is the ability of this group to really be vulnerable with each other in the chat and the stories that are being shared, and really create this this virtual place. And I also want to acknowledge the people who are comfortable asking the really challenging questions, and not just, oh, the person's saying this, therefore it must be true. Like, no, ask the question about death and pandemic and the Holocaust and how does this all tie together? Because if it can't be applied to those circumstances, if it doesn't hold up under the extremes, then it might not be true. And if it doesn't hold up under the extremes and the test, then when we're tested in our own lives, how will we know that this is something that could hold up or be a useful tool? So I would encourage, continue to challenge. And if the answers still don't sit right with you, follow up. And you know what? I'll close with a different Torah just because chaplaincy came up. Julie, I hope no one's giving a class in 2 minutes, but if not, they can sign on very, very quickly. That specifically when you're comforting a mourner, the phrase that we use is Hamakom yinachem etchem b'toch sha'ar v'lei Tzion Yerushalayim. May God comfort you amongst the mourners of Zion in Jerusalem. And I heard this piece of wisdom from Rabbi Weil, who's a close mentor of mine. He said there are many different names for God. Hashem, Kel, Elohim. Why Hamakom? Why the place? And the answer that he gave was that in that moment, their entire world is shifted. And they don't feel like they have a place. They don't feel like they have an anchor. And specifically at that moment where they're in this whirlwind and feeling disconnected, we remind them, no, Hamakom, you do have a place. You have a place in the community. You have a place still with God. You have a place here with us. We are showing up with you and creating a space that we are here together in. And I think, to Sherry's point about chaplaincy, in that moment, it's not a, let me explain to you why this ultimately will be good. You're not making an intellectual argument. It's Hamakom. I'm with you in this space. Hamakom, there is still a space for you. Hamakom, we are in a similar space now. Later on, we can have all these other conversations. But right now, we're just here with each other for each other. And that's another tool.